I'd like to just start off and kick off and say good afternoon to everyone in South Africa and good morning to David. And the topic of the webinar today is on holistic management. And I think everybody in South Africa in particular and other rangeland scientists from around the world will know that the topic and the issue of holistic management in rangelands is a controversial topic. It's been around for quite a long time. There have been many arguments going backwards and forwards, many publications, and also many Congress presentations talking about various aspects of holistic management. And we felt that for this Sundowner webinar series that we're holding, it would be great to get probably the world's expert on looking at the science of holistic management and commenting on the science, Dr. David Briske, to give us a talk and to give us the benefit of his 40 years of assessing holistic management. And he's going to be giving us some reflections on that this afternoon. And Dr. David Briske is a very prominent person in rangeland ecology. He's from Texas A&M University, and he's been involved in rangeland ecology for his whole career. He has served as the editor-in-chief of Rangeland Ecology and Management, which is the journal of the American Society for Range Management. And he's also fulfilled editorial roles with various other journals and publications. And his current research is focused on climate risk planning in support of rangeland conservation and sustainable beef cattle production in the Great Plains of America, and looking at re-envisioning global benefits of rangelands through a more complete accounting of diverse ecosystem services provision. So that's his general research focus. But over the years, he's been quite heavily involved in looking at holistic management, evaluating holistic management, and commenting on holistic management. So we're very grateful that David has agreed to present this webinar to us, and even more great in the USA. So David, thank you very much for that. Happy Thanksgiving, and thank you very much for giving up part of your public holiday to talk to us. So without any further ado, David, over to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to address my South African colleagues today. Academic exchange is especially enjoyable during this period of lockdown. We're going into a COVID spike just as you're leaving yours. Now, I have not addressed holistic management my entire career, but it's certainly been a prominent issue throughout my entire career. My entry into the direct assessment of holistic management is really a bit serendipitous. In 2005, a Canadian colleague, Walter Wilms, approached me and a few other colleagues with the concern that holistic management was gaining tremendous popularity in the Canadian prairie provinces. And he wanted a group to organize and address that issue, that concern of his. Well, I adamantly refused initially. I was of the opinion at that time, 2005, that this would be a history lesson. The situation has already been resolved. The jury has already rendered a verdict that it's ineffective. I don't recall the details, but Walter, along with input from colleagues, convinced me otherwise. We convened a symposium on holistic management at the 2006 Society of Range Management meeting, and then that was the basis for the 2008 publication in Rangeland Ecology and Management, and I was tremendously surprised by the intensity of the response to that paper. Now, what I'll do is I'm going to present a retrospective, looking at the big picture without necessarily relitigating all of the ecological data, which I'm sure most of you have observed. However, I will reference some of the most very recent ecological data by way of comparing information and findings from South Africa and the US. My conclusions then are going to wax a bit philosophic as I consider holistic management as a learning opportunity for the global rangeland community. Okay, well, let's begin with what is really a major rangeland conundrum. Holistic management is among the most influential events in the rangeland profession, but we're uncertain as to why that's the case. Well, that's not a very satisfying position for an academic profession to be in. So these following topics really highlight the general themes of my presentation this afternoon. Was our profession predisposed to holistic management? Claims of the benefit of rotational grazing have always been unsupported, even prior to holistic management. Current research findings are consistent with the prior results. And then that leaves the really perplexing questions of why does holistic management persist, and what can the global rangeland profession learn from this rather intense chapter in its history. Well, in terms of grazing management in the U.S., it emerged in response to tremendous rangeland degradation that occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The first formal description of grazing management was presented by Arthur Sampson, who was an employee with the U.S. Forest Service that had just initially been formed in 1905. Sampson was a master's student of Frederick Clements at the University of Nebraska. And then he went on to become what's known as the father of American range management. He served a distinguished academic career at University of California, Davis. But in response to this intensive and exploitive grazing, he came up with this deferred rotational grazing idea, which simply says that we're not going to graze a particular area until the grass plants have set seed. And that's going to allow opportunities for recovery of this degraded rangeland, but yet we can continue to graze livestock on it. Well, that was a very seminal study that had a huge influence on the American rangeland profession. Other Forest Service employees, Gus Formay in particular, introduced rest rotation. He was also with the U.S. Forest Service at that time. Throughout this whole time, this Clementsian succession provides the reference for the quality or condition of the grassland. And then when Alan Savory entered the scene, he promoted enhanced production of forage and livestock in addition to the restoration alone. In fact, the only time I've met Alan Savory was in 1980 when we both arrived in Texas as much younger men. Now, you're familiar with principles of holistic management, and here I'm still referencing the website in 2013 because I found the current one even less informative or more ambiguous. The quotes are the italics are mine here. Holistic management helps people develop strategies for managing herds of domestic livestock that mimic wild herds to heal the land. Tuck this in the back of your mind. I think this might be really a critical point to understanding the persistence. And then he seems to be referencing here the ecosystem concepts, rangeland heterogeneity, all fair enough. Properly managed livestock can improve land health. I think there's considerable concern there, and this idea of timed grazing also has received tremendous scrutiny. And some of the purported ecological benefits follow here: increased control of grazing patterns, improved species composition, forage quality, plant and animal production, surface hydrology, and most recently, increased carbon sequestration has been getting a tremendous amount of attention. So that's quite a list of advantages to this grazing strategy. And then in March of 2013, Mr. Savory presented his famous or infamous TED Talk, depending on your perspective. And I must say, when I saw that, I thought, okay, this whole holistic management thing is finished. These claims are so unreasonable that no one's going to take them seriously. Another one of the many cases where I've been proven wrong, 7 million views later and still going. Here, of course, are some of the claims he made in that video. There's only one option left, that is to do the unthinkable, use livestock in bunches. We cannot reduce animal numbers to rest grasslands because it's going to cause more desertification. And then this really outlandish claim that holistic management on 50% of the Earth's grasslands would remove CO2 to pre-industrial levels. Well, this led to some other grandiose cowspircies, making reference here to the book Cows Save the Planet. The point of this is that it's very hard for a scientific organization, it's very hard for academics to meaningfully engage with a procedure holistic management whose spokesperson is making these kinds of claims. And these comments here are reviews I pulled from Amazon on this book by Judith Swartz. Tuck this one in the back of your mind as well. This book makes me happy. Now, all of this is playing out in absolute disregard for the tremendous concern of livestock and the ecological footprint of livestock and the contribution that it's making to the Anthropocene. We're all familiar with the fact that ruminant herbivores have among the highest ecological footprint in terms of livestock production. We look at this, livestock currently comprise the largest amount of mammalian biomass on the planet. And Mr. Savory may get a chance to test his hypothesis of doing the unthinkable because the number of, or the amount of animal livestock biomass is to increase substantially by mid-century. Okay, that's our general backdrop. Let's drill down a little bit further. I think a big part of the problem with navigating this issue of holistic management over the past several decades has been its multiple meanings and interpretations. So I take holistic management to have at least 3 general components. One of them is the one we address most often. That's the intensive rotational grazing, or you might refer to it as high-density rotational grazing. There's also this adaptive management idea. The Savory schools have placed a fair amount of emphasis on sort of agribusiness decision-making activities. And then least recognized and based on input from my social science colleagues, what might be the most important aspect of holistic management is this human perception of holistic management, how it relates to stewardship, agencies of these landowners, well-being of these landowners, family planning and goals, and those kinds of issues. Savory as a spokesman, I guess, could be put in there as a third or as a fourth component. The other issue that I think makes this difficult to navigate is that there are multiple valid reasons for extensive rotational grazing, and here I've just listed some of them here. So I think there's confusion about the intensive and the extensive rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is widely and commonly used, but the intensive application of holistic management is not. Now, the benefits of just rotational grazing have been consistently challenged. This is a list of some of the major reviews and commentaries on the benefits of rotational grazing compared to continuous grazing. The same Arthur Sampson that introduced the deferred grazing initially in 1919 stated in 1951 that there were certainly two distinct views already that had emerged regarding the value of rotational grazing. That is, the practitioners and managers thought it was valuable. The people conducting research considered it to be much less significant. Harold Heddy, very influential in U.S. range science, actually the direct replacement for Arthur Sampson at University of California, Davis, stated in 1961 that there was no benefit, no ecological benefit of rotational grazing. The Australians came in, Peter O'Regan and Turner, 1992, echoing that same interpretation of rotational grazing. Jerry Holacek, a widely recognized figure in U.S. range science, said the same. A number of colleagues and I published our review in 2008. Heidi Hawkins reviewed much of the same data and came up with a review with very similar conclusions in 2017. Yet, holistic management persists. Here is a table from that 2008 paper that was published. Justin Derner, I'll introduce in a moment. Extremely important co-author. He did a lot of the number crunching and data analysis on that. But if we look here at this example where stocking rates consistent. So the dark bar is where continuous is equal to rotational grazing. This gray bar is continuous grazing is greater than rotational. So for livestock production per unit land area, usually there's no difference. The number of cases where continuous is greater than rotational far exceeds the cases where rotational is superior. As you would expect, we see the same thing here for livestock production per head, and then here is forage production or plant standing crop. So the cases of them being equal is by far dominant, that there is no difference in plant production or NPP between grazed and ungrazed, or between grazed continuously and grazed rotationally in terms of biomass. These studies covered a gradient of about 300 to 750 millimeters. I fully expected that there would have been an increasing benefit of intensive rotational grazing as you approached more mesic systems. That was not the case. Addressing a few of the other major claims that Mr. Savory has made in this TED Talk, and he sort of advocated throughout his career, is that grazing is needed to prevent grassland or rangeland degradation. Well, if there are cases of that, they are very limited. That's refuted by long-term vegetation records where communities remain very stable in terms of composition and NPP without grazing or with limited grazing. We're all familiar with very positive responses to grazing exclusion. Ecological processes are often not improved by grazing, as has been suggested. This includes infiltration and organic carbon content, and many grasslands have evolved with few large grazers. And biological soil crusts generally appear to be beneficial rather than detrimental. Protection from soil erosion. They're sources of nitrogen fixation in the case of these cryptogamic crusts in many semi-arid systems. So that, I think, can be dismissed or has been dismissed. The other topic that has gained considerable attention is increased carbon sequestration associated with holistic management. And there's a lot of work on this, but I'm going to highlight some of the Australian research. They've been very active the past decade because Australia has adopted a carbon farming initiative in 2011, and the research community was busy trying to document the carbon potential carbon increases. Well, the upshot of this is that few options exist to increase soil carbon in infertile weathered soils with low precipitation, as in the case of Australia. Here's just some studies from various portions of the country. This Badgery one compared a large number of systems that had been managed continuously and rotationally, and finding no difference among them. So recently, an Australian review that global rangeland carbon mitigation potential is lower than often implied. And just to think about that in a little bit broader perspective, I'm going to look at this Ahlstrom paper that was published in Science in 2015. It gained a lot of attention as semi-arid lands being an important global carbon sink, which is interesting. So we can pay attention simply to the red line here, net biome productivity. So it's simply the difference between carbon influx by photosynthesis and carbon efflux, or release by respiration. Let's just look at the red line here for semi-arid land. So this is the zero line here, where there would be no net exchange. So they're simply making the point that many of us were already familiar with, is that you see tremendous fluctuations among years in response to weather patterns. Temperature and precipitation are the major drivers of this. So these semi-arid lands vary widely between being carbon sources, releasing CO2 as indicated by the negative value, or as weak carbon sinks as shown here by positive values. Now, they were referencing a period of favorable years where the amount of carbon in these semi-arid lands were above zero, meaning that these semi-arid lands were a strong carbon sink. But we know what happened the following decade. And the projections for certainly warming, drying, and increased variability, especially of precipitation, I think really reduce the possibility of any type of management having large-scale increases in carbon sequestration of arid and semi-arid lands. Now, there were two remaining criticisms, sort of 2010-ish or so, when we published those reviews. And they were that scientific evidence hadn't adequately accounted for the role of adaptive management, which is an important component of holistic management. Fair enough. How does adaptive management interact with grazing systems? Have stewardship goals been excluded previously. The second criticism was the experimental work had been done at very small scale, so it does not mimic actual working landscape ranches or farms. Therefore, the decision-making environment is insufficient to really evaluate the full potential of holistic management. Well, here I'd like to introduce Dr. Justin Derner and his accomplished research team, David Augustine, Lauren Perinsky, Maria Fernandez-Gomez, and Haley Wilmer. Maria and Haley are the social scientists. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this group directly contributed to this presentation with some very valuable comments, and then they've also enhanced my understanding of grazing systems tremendously as I've collaborated with them on this collaborative adaptive rangeland management project. I really think Justin took a bold and assertive step to develop this experimental approach to address the remaining concerns of holistic management. And what's unique about it, first of all, I should probably point out where this is. It's in northeast Colorado, sort of corner of Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska on the western Great Plains. Short grass area, sort of 350 millimeters of precipitation per year. So what this is, very briefly, is there are 10 130-hectare paddocks for each of 2 grazing systems, and they were paired on unique ecological sites. The CARM treatment, the abbreviation for this title, is adaptively managed with intensive monitoring. So it's rotationally grazed, and the decisions are made by 11-person stakeholder group, a portion of which are local livestock producers, and the other portion are regional conservationists, national agencies, as well as regional conservation NGOs. And then the response of this CARM treatment is compared against traditional rangeland management, which is simply season-long continuous grazing. So I'm going to show you some of the very current results from this portion of the CARM experiment and compare them to some recent South African data. So here we're looking at average daily gain of steers over a period of several years in both this rotationally and adaptively managed CARM treatment compared to the more traditional continuous treatment. With the exception of the first year coming out of a dry period, you will see that consistently the traditional continuous grazing has higher animal gains than does the intensive rotational system. The difference there across years is roughly about 14 or 15%. So the point of this is that adaptive management in this particular case is insufficient. Adaptive management supplied by tremendous monitoring information provided by the research team to these decision makers, the stakeholder decision group that were making these decisions, that was insufficient to offset the higher stock density associated with the rotational system. Now, those animal production patterns are very consistent with Venter, Kramer, Hawkins' work from the Merino walk farm that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Here over a period of several years, we're simply looking at animal weight. Season-long grazing is this beige or light brown color, and the blue or gray is the high-density rotational grazing system. And you'll see that oftentimes you have higher animal gain with the continuous than with the intensive rotational, and then in other cases they can be fairly similar. So strong parallels between those recent findings. The same group, Winter et al., went on to conduct this very impressive landscape analysis of holistic management, looking at some 48 farms that have been consistently managed over 15 years using a interesting combination of survey remotely sensed and ground truthing data. And what they found was that the high-density rotational grazing systems were relatively similar to neighboring properties that use less intensive systems for a number of important grazing system metrics. So I think these two pieces of work, the CARM work and this landscape assessment, go a long way towards indicating that insufficient scale doesn't really contribute to the lack of positive findings of ecological research for holistic management. Another part of this CARM study that is just being reviewed now, led by Lauren Perinsky, is looking at tiller defoliation patterns. And here we're looking at the proportion of tillers grazed and the number of times tillers of a individual grass species, a western wheatgrass, Pascopyrum smithii, were grazed. Here's the CARM, that's this rotational grazing treatment, and this is the season long. And in both years, you see they're virtually identical in terms of proportion of tillers grazed, as well as the number of time grazed. In some associated grazing treatments with very high stocking rates, you'll see that the proportion of tillers grazed goes up, as well as the number of times that this grass species was grazed increases. So the point of this is that the so-called nutritional wisdom of livestock is strongly expressed, and it can only be minimized with extremely high stock densities, which is going to simultaneously decrease animal weight gain. And again, the Winter group came up with some very similar types of findings, looking at bite mark technique here, and this is actually fecal DNA analysis for plants of various functional groups or species composition. And you can see in comparing season long and this high density rotational grazing that there are really very few differences. Again, some strong parallels between the very recent work in Colorado and this South African work. The CARM group has also done cost-benefit analyses, and the results turn out to be very similar to what Winter et al. Produced. It turns out the Winter presentation is much cleaner and more appealing. So I've presented that here. And what you see here is that the expenses, the cost of setup, relatively low in the continuous graze system, much higher in the holistic system, as you would anticipate. The running or operating costs also much higher in the holistic system than in the season-long system. And then when you look at return on investment, obviously much higher with season-long than with the holistic. Well, this economic message was really one of the major drivers for us putting together that 2008 review initially. It was to make it clear, a warning of sorts, that grazing system intensification will not yield economic returns on semi-arid rangelands. I hope we discuss this later on, because the fact that it goes unheeded is very difficult for me to really appreciate and understand. Okay, so what we've done to this point is a more sort of traditional comparison of of holistic management. What I'd like to do now is maybe take it a step further and look at a very deep critique of holistic management relative to the global rangeland profession. Why have ecological processes advocated by holistic management failed by and large? Well, I think we've resolved that. Why does holistic management continue to persist? We have not resolved that. What lessons has our profession learned? I'm not sure we've considered that sufficiently. And how should we move forward based on those lessons? So what might the 65th or 75th Annual Congress of the Grassland Society of Southern Africa look like? What types of expertise will be there? What types of challenges will be addressed? What type of results might be shared? Well, in terms of why the purported benefits of holistic management have not proven to occur, I think is because we fail to really appreciate the major drivers, or maybe the priority of major drivers of grazed ecosystems. So we hypothesized this in 2008 that weather climate is the primary driver in these semi-arid systems, followed by stocking rate, tremendous literature to support that, followed by decision making, that's in addition to the stocking rate. And that can be highly varied and complex. And then you come down to grazing systems. Well, the point of this is grazing system is the weakest driver. And somehow in holistic management, and maybe our profession has even bought into it to some extent, we've relegated this weak driver up to a much higher position than we should have. So the fact that these grazing systems generally behave in a very similar manner is very likely because they're dominated by these very strong drivers. Why does holistic management persist? Well, I think it's because it's placed grazing management in a social ecological framework. It's placed grazing management in the decision-making framework of ranchers, or I believe you would call them farmers. So we've mentioned previously this agribusiness idea. A large part of the holistic management school addresses these agribusiness issues. And then there's constant reference to life quality goals and professional identity. I do not have a very good understanding of that. Ranchers or farmers have valued this contribution much more than academics. I think we continue to look past it to a large extent. It's been brought to our attention by social scientists that have recently joined us in investigating this interesting process. And I think some of their conclusions are that holistic management might in some way empower ranchers to enhance their own capacity and their own stewardship, as opposed to what we would normally do as rangeland professionals and ask them or recommend to them that they adopt a particular procedure that we have developed for ecological reasons. Another reason for, I think, its persistence, it continues to be promoted by multiple entities. We're all familiar with strong testimonials by holistic management advocates. We dismiss those, obviously, because of the lack of ecological benefits, but at the same time, we're overlooking some of these other considerations. And then we have state and federal agencies that continue to promote it in spite of knowing that the ecological research doesn't prove that rotational grazing has benefits. So I can only assume that they're of the opinion, well, rotational grazing still must be better than continuous grazing. So they continue to support it and actually offer a cost share to promote it. Another potentially important discussion topic. Continuing on with some of the social science contributions here, I think we as rangeland professionals have overlooked the complex decision-making environment of ranchers. That is the complex adaptive system in which they must operate. This is work done by Haley Wilmer. In other words, rangeland management does not equal ecological science. We as a profession might look past that more often than we should. And there's very diverse management goals, and these goals can be very value-laden. Another social scientist, Hannah Gosnell, goes on to indicate that ecologically mechanistic, you might even throw in reductionist and epistemologically positivist research approach is insufficient to address holistic management, and therefore many other rangeland challenges we're soon to encounter. And what I think that means is epistemology, of course, the study of knowledge or knowledge theory. This positive knowledge is definitive and objective. So the speed of light or the molecular weight of hydrogen would be positivist knowledge. Complex problems do not have single objective or positive answers, I think is what she's saying. So this alternative knowledge form is needed, constructivist knowledge. This is much more negotiable and more subjective than objective. So it might be addressing what are the top 3 ecosystem services provided by South African rangelands? What's the best way to manage sustainably to maintain those 3 most important ecological services in South African rangelands? Well, clearly that requires this negotiable knowledge that is very subjective. Now, objective portions might be involved, but by and large, it's going to be a negotiated type of decision-making process. Well, what are the professional implications here? Well, first of all, I think the hypothesis we raised in 2011, which is a follow-up sort of a social perspective to the 2008 review, stands. The rotational grazing debate, you could insert holistic management there, is a symptom of a much larger underlying problem within the rangeland profession, the absence of an adequate framework to evaluate and manage complex adaptive systems involving both social and ecological components. So what that's saying is a social ecological systems framework, I think, is absolutely essential. We've begun to develop that. Participatory research and management is clearly required, scientists and diverse stakeholders. We probably need to be thinking more carefully about emphasizing the most important issues or drivers of some of these challenges. And we might really want to think about a transdisciplinary approach to rangeland management in the future. And that's not just multiple disciplines, but it's taking the knowledge of these multiple disciplines and sort of perceiving and working with the system in a very different way. I'm concerned that rangeland management of 2020 rests very heavily on the foundation established in 1920. And it's very hard to make the necessary changes to address the complexity of what we see in contemporary issues today. All right, and then just very briefly, another challenge that we face broadly and in specific with holistic management is this issue of pseudoscience. So that could be a 4th component of holistic management. And let's look at the attributes of pseudoscience as described by Hansen and think about them relative to Mr. Savory's TED Talk. Use of vague, exaggerated, untestable claims, check. Emphasis on confirmation rather than refutation, check. Obsessive focuses on a narrow problem, check. Absence of progress in conceptual development, check. There has not been much advance in HM in the 40 years. Personalization of issues, authoritarian personality, attacks critics, claims conspiracy, check. Right, well, this is more damaging to the public than to the scientific community for I think, obvious reasons. So is this contributing to the polarization of the scientific community and the practitioners or farmers? It's dangerous in that it's leading to potentially negative or non-beneficial outcomes by oversimplifying rangelands and their management. I think we in the US continue to direct resources into non-viable approaches. And then probably most damaging, it just increases the wedge between science and management knowledge at a time when science management policy partnerships are desperately needed. So what can we do to counter pseudoscience, if anything? That certainly gets us into this academic objectivity versus advocacy. I don't know if you folks have been having that argument. It's fairly common here in the States. The other lesson to be learned here is that narratives are extremely powerful. They're recognized to hold a privileged position in human cognition. We seem to learn and retain knowledge in the forms of narratives or stories. And what makes the pseudoscience so dangerous is that humans seem to function by what's called causal attribution to explain the world. So an understanding, sometimes called a mental model, has to simply be efficient and satisfying, but not necessarily accurate. So the review of the book, Cows Save the World, made them feel happy. Well, that's a causal attribution that wasn't evaluated very, very carefully, obviously, but still it was a satisfying narrative to that as well as other individuals. The question becomes, how can we disrupt these narratives, or can we create our own narrative? If we would have had a better narrative of range management and grazing management prior to 1980, would holistic management have caught hold to the extent it has? All right. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to make just a few concluding comments. And I'm going to conclude by returning to the conundrum that we began the presentation with, and that is, why does holistic management persist, even though large amounts of research have really demonstrated that the ecological benefits do not occur? In fact, I would go as far as to say there's probably little value in continuing to address these ecological benefits. I would hypothesize that the impact of holistic management on the global rangeland profession is because it's revealed what can be called several blind spots. So the absence of a compelling range management narrative, I think, is one. Narrow problem framing based on our tendency as ecological scientists to exclude social and cultural considerations, probably another. There are limits of ecological research that we may not fail to appreciate, and probably insufficient recognition of multiple knowledge sources. And I would go on to state that how we deal with these blind spots is going to have a huge impact on how successful the global rangeland profession is in dealing with rangeland stewardship in the future. Once again, I really appreciate the opportunity to address you this afternoon. And with that, Kevin, I'm going to turn it back to you.
David, thank you very much for that very fascinating presentation. I'd like to open this webinar up to questions from our attendees. Please post your questions in the question and answer box rather than in the chat box. And then once a question has been posted, you can check the little thumbs up, which will elevate the question to the top. So it effectively likes the question, and it will ensure that the most liked question goes to the top, and that will definitely get to answer your question. So David, there's one question here from Karen Esler, and she says, could one see holistic management as a purely social process, nothing to do with a grazing system? In some work done by an MSc student, De Villiers Esler Knight, in 2014, we concluded holistic management may connect individual decision makers to collective decision making through social learning networks in the form of study groups. This could support learning and innovation, which is key to building adaptive capacity.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that's really a wonderful insight. You know, I do not know that. I'm sort of relying on my social science colleagues when I deal in that particular realm. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that merits a lot more consideration. And, you know, that shouldn't be dismissed, because the increased adaptive capacity of groups of farmers or ranchers, I mean, could prove to be really valuable. And I would wonder if we couldn't even take it a step further and find out how we could engage with that. Haley Wilmer points out that a problem with that is this power disparity. So how can we bring in academic knowledge that's generally viewed as holding the privileged position, and how can we integrate that in a two-way street with these learning networks that you describe?
Thank you very much for that. So I think particularly in the social component and the narrative, the storytelling, is that something that we are really getting wrong as scientists? I know that we often get fingers pointed at us to say that we're very bad at communication in the popular sense. We write these scientific papers that people can't access and that. So is that a general failing of the science community in this regard?
Well, I'm of the opinion, and again, I'm sort of coming into this in the last decade, and this CARM project has been a real motivator to have me move in this direction. But I do think we need to do a lot better job of integrating our information into the broader community. I mean, the academic literature alone is not going to get it done, right? And currently, there's very little incentive for academics other than extension specialists to spend time in participatory research type of projects, right? So yes, we could do more of that, but there's a lot of barriers to us doing that and getting recognized and encouraged to do that. But yeah, I think we just need a lot more collaborative engagement. So in other words, to the previous question, what could we really learn from some of these social networks that are embracing holistic management? And we'd have to move away from the grandiose claims of Mr. Savory and so on. But there are some I think, very sound practitioners of this, right? What are they doing? How do they understand it to benefit their systems? And then in turn, what could we do to maybe contribute to that?
That's great. Thank you. So we have a question from Heidi Hawkins, and she says, thank you so much, David. Do you know of any examples where a good socio-ecological framework has been used successfully in season-long approaches where they too have learning networks?
Hi, Heidi. Let me think about that for a moment. Well, they don't get the very high profile, but in this Eastern Colorado project, there are a couple of long-term grazing associations. So these are sort of semi-formal networks, Heidi, where they make collective decisions, and they're especially important in this particular case because much of the grazing land they're using is leased from the U.S. Forest Service, so they have to negotiate these allotment leases. So it's best done with a collective viewpoint, these grazing associations. So I think that the knowledge sharing in those is somewhat reflective of what you're suggesting, social learning networks for, it would be continuous grazing, and it would also be extensive rotational grazing and so on. So those exist all over the U.S. So they don't quite have the profile. They always don't have the websites and so on, but they serve, I think, a similar role.
Great. The next question is from Maged, and I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name incorrectly, but the question is, in arid ecosystem, holistic management seems to be difficult according to the low biomass. However, livestock like camels have a strategy in grazing in different seasons. So we're looking at a different livestock unit there.
So the question is then how we could use different livestock in holistic management? I'm not quite sure. Could you read that again, please?
Sure, let me just go back to that. Oh, there we go. So in arid ecosystems, so it's on the dry end of the scale,
right.
Holistic management seems to be difficult. So comparing the mesic to the arid areas because of the low biomass in arid ecosystems. And then, but certain livestock like camel have a strategy in grazing in these more arid areas. So
yeah, I know very little about camels other than I think they're largely browsers, I believe, aren't they? But you know, the holistic management is billed as being efficient in these brittle systems, as Mr. Savory terms them, and I take that to mean semi-arid, perhaps not arid as the question describes, but clearly, you know, as you get into these more arid systems, then these major drivers of grazing systems of weather and stocking rate, I think, just far and away exceed any contribution that a grazing system can make.
thank you for that. Now we have a question from William Bond. He says, the big environmental problems are holistic, requiring understanding of linkages between different components. Our training is primarily reductionist hypothesis testing. How do you test which part of a holistic analysis is wrong and needs to be corrected?
Yeah, hi, William. That's a very good question. And I think we need to take steps as a profession to develop a capacity to do that. Now, how we actually do that, I'm not so sure. I think first of all, working within what I'm calling a social ecological system, which also could be a complex adaptive system. But I think we need to much more strongly engage with the socioeconomic and the sort of human agency aspect of natural resource management. And in rangelands, I'm getting the impression this plays a very strong role in some of these rather harsh environments where these ranchers and farmers have very little control over anything, right? They don't control the weather, they don't control the markets. They're sort of at the whims of variability. So risk and uncertainty are huge there. So I think the question becomes, can we identify the critical components in these complex social ecological systems and understand their interrelationships? I'm not sure it's so much about testing right or wrong as sort of just understanding the dynamics of those systems. And I would hope someone of your capacity would take the challenge of perhaps moving us in that direction. I think it's a really, really necessary step.
Thank you. Karen just responded to the answer that you gave, and she said, for me, it points very much to the role of extension services and facilitating networks amongst farmer communities. Perhaps that's where the solution lies. So it's a comment, not a question.
I would agree entirely, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. The next question is from Zander Fenter. He says, appreciate the talk, David. If holistic management never existed, what hot topics or questions would the rangeland science community have tackled in its place?
Man, awesome question. I have not thought about that, so I don't think I could come up with an answer. No, I'm stumped. Let's open that up to the total audience. That is a wonderful question.
Right. So, audience, please put your comments in to Zander's question. You can type in directly in the question and answer box to his question. Next up is a question from Mike Peel. He says, thanks for the interesting talk. So much to comment on. I feel that the integration of science, academic, and management remains elusive. We need to look at what works here. I think we will find that many of these systems are just the same paradigms written differently. I think that's what he's trying to say.
Well, I agree that the let's say a more effective linkage between rangeland science and rangeland management and application remains elusive. In fact, I've sort of become infatuated with the general relationship of science and management. I would wager to emphasize your point that if we asked 10 individuals what the relationship was between science and management for rangeland application, we'd get 10 different answers. I'm maybe not entirely clear on them being the same paradigm. As I understand it, we're sort of working with what I consider to be a very much 20th century paradigm. So from a US perspective, I mean, it goes all the way back to, Sampson in the very early 1900s with the start of the rangeland profession in the US. And I think we're struggling to move to the next paradigm, which is sort of the one that William referenced in his question. How do we get to more of a systems view where we're thinking much more about interaction of social ecological components? And that's challenging for us. We're not trained that way. And even when we have social scientists in our research groups and on our faculties, that's a challenge to meaningfully interact with them. But I think we need to get out of our comfort zones and take some very important steps in those directions to create, which perhaps could be a new paradigm of rangeland research.
Indeed. So we have reached an hour, which is the standard time for our webinar, but David has graciously agreed to take on more questions. So please feel free to keep posting your questions, and we'll keep the webinar going a little while. Gina asks the question, thank you, David. I have found that landowners are often quite skeptical of scientific approaches to range management, and they seem to relate more easily to the popular, e.g. Savory approaches. And yet the landowners also show tremendous knowledge of their systems, which align with ecological processes. Do you think that we should be working more closely with landowners to better inform the science we do?
Absolutely. I think we could create a much better two-way street there in a participatory framework. And also, the early part of your question, I think, deserves much more attention than we give it as well. And again, back to this point of scientific knowledge being viewed as being privileged. So that's going to put off, I think, some farmers, right? Farmers, ranchers, because of that. And then as I mentioned in my presentation, and again, this is just sort of a general thought, is that the holistic management system seems to be working much more directly with the farmers to increase their capacity, increase their ability to make decisions, empower them, allow them to be their own sort of knowledge brokers. Well, academia almost reverses that, right? In some ways, they could perceive us to be disempowering them. Here's what we know about the ecology, and here's how it translates to management, even though we might not understand the complex management environment they're dealing with that well, and here's what you should do. Well, that could be viewed as disempowering rather than empowering. So I'm just wondering if those types of social dynamics or human dynamics don't come into play.
Thank you for that. Garci asks a question, did I understand you correctly that the lack of support for ecological benefits of rotational grazing is related to the spatial scale? And if so, what are the main reasons for that?
Well, I'm not sure it is related to the spatial scale. What I was attempting to point out is for the last 10 or 15 years, the two challenges to the rangeland research indicating that there are no ecological benefits of holistic management were scale and adaptive management. Well, I think now these two recent studies, the Vintner and the Augustine studies, really provide some convincing evidence that even at large scales, we fail to see major ecological benefits taking place. The other point I was making there, and this is sort of irrespective of scale, is that I think it's weather and stocking rate are really these dominant drivers. And so the role that something like a grazing system can play is, unless it's, complete rest or very intensive grazing, it is a fairly minor one if you want to try and keep an ecologically and economically viable system in place.
The next question is from Mahmoud. What are the cost-benefit ratio of using HEMA system in grazing in arid regions? So the cost-benefit ratios.
Well, I think it would be probably the worst case scenario in those systems because you have the least primary production. And if there's no benefit from the intensive rotational system, you're investing this and this infrastructure with very little opportunity for return. That's sort of why I was suggesting, as we worked with these studies along the environmental precipitation gradient of about 300 to 750 millimeters annually, I sort of thought that the cost-benefit ratio would become more favorable as you moved into the more mesic zones because you had higher net primary production. But that didn't appear at all, which I still find surprising. Again, maybe just suggesting that, again, the dominant drivers of these graze systems are precipitation and stocking rate.
Right. Zakele says, it seems to me that public opinion can have huge effect on policymakers. How would it be possible to counter the often knee-jerk reaction of the non-scientific community and bring the public on board, sort of trying to get science informing policies rather than feelings?
Yeah, well, one wonderful question. I have thought about that. So just a very brief example of that. Our government, our U.S. Department of Agriculture, has really begun promoting this idea of soil health and soil carbon sequestration, and we've discussed the limited potential for that occurring on semi-arid rangelands, especially, right? So how does that get started? Well, it gets started with lobbyists who are not scientists making these claims to politicians. It gets written into legislation or a U.S. Farm Bill in this particular case, and away we go. And then the scientific community is left to monitor and look at the potential and the cost-benefit ratio of those policy decisions. So the little bit I've checked into this, that's the way it continually works, is that the policy is not front-end loaded. The science comes in after the fact, after, in your terms, the public has made this general set of decisions. Yeah, another just extreme example in the U.S. is the ethanol biofuels production and the tremendous cost inefficiency of that. But that's just become ingrained in our U.S. agricultural policy. Cost benefit be damned. So it seems that's the lot that's been delivered to us. We're not in the driver's seat. We're sort of following up and recommending after the fact. And I guess we would all hope that could be changed, but I don't see that being the case anytime soon. And again, we would come back to these big issues requiring this constructivist knowledge, right? So science, even if it is up front, it's only going to be one part.
Yeah. Heidi has added to that and said good marketing of management that is co-created by landowners and scientists and is evidence-based. So the three pillars to that.
Yeah, that could be our model, Heidi.
Then I have a series of comments from James Gambiza. He says, thanks, David, for an excellent presentation. First, my comments. The first one, context is extremely important. For example, we cannot extrapolate findings from large-scale experiments, commercial farming, to small-scale common property systems. Communal systems are characterized by continuous season-long grazing, high stocking rates, e.g. double the recommended rates, mixed grazes, and some are highly degraded. There are few examples from the literature that provide evidence from communal systems. The next comment is there is a lot of literature from government research organizations which is not normally included in reviews of evidence of grazing management. The next comment, evidence from meta-analyses show high heterogeneity, e.g. among studies included in the reviews. Fourthly, a social ecological systems framework is extremely important in our research and management of rangelands. And finally, a one-size-fits-all will not get us anywhere. It is important to acknowledge different knowledge sources. Once again, thanks for a brilliant presentation.
I would tend to agree with all of those comments.
Okay, thank you. Then getting back to William Bond. One large set of questions is about sustainability, how to sustain livestock grazing or browsing systems for centuries / millennia. It seems such a rickety business. Trees pouring in now, grass composition changing to inedible stuff, loss of plant cover, soil erosion. What do you need for the system to look after itself while top harvesting by farmers?
Yeah, very, very forward-looking question, William. Several colleagues and I are thinking about that in our U.S. Great Plains, and I would add another variable of climate change, and that is throughout this century, the total precipitation is not projected to change markedly, either decrease or increase, but the variability, both wet and dry years, are anticipated to increase, and then plus the warming is going to increase drying as well. So you're right, it's a rickety business already, even here as well. The profit margins are extremely low. So as we get into increased climate variability and increased woody plant input, I don't see how under the current model these ranching operations can remain economically viable. And then my other concern is, what does that mean to our remaining grasslands? So half of our Great Plains remain as grasslands, the other half, the mesic half, have been converted into cropping systems. So there's a strong conservation issue at play here as well. So we've been thinking about coming up with what we would call climate adaptation pathways. So come up with sort of scenarios with increasing degrees of climate adaptation, some of which have not been entertained to this point. So we might have to be willing with state or national partnerships to move livestock large distances during drought periods. We might have to think of ways with state or national partnerships to be able to restock, to destock and restock without the individual ranchers or farmers taking an economic beating on that. There might have to be some type of, I hate to use the word subsidy, but there might have to be some type of buffer put into those kinds of situations. And ultimately it's going to depend on how bad do we want beef. And it looks like there's a high demand. During drought periods, people continue to buy beef at twice the standard price. But all of those are pressing issues. And if the livestock grazing is lost, what happens to that land? What happens to those remaining grasslands and their biodiversity and ownership even? So those are, I agree with your perspective. Those are some pressing challenges, and we're going to try and make a stand here in our Western Great Plains on that very topic. I would certainly welcome any comments or thoughts you have on that.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is from Justin Dutoy. He says, are people not perhaps inevitably attracted to the popular, freakish, simple, and bizarre, e.g. see North America in the past 4 years, and us scientists must take a Fortean approach, ignore provocations, and plod on producing our useful, if less sparky, results?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. To the first part, I would guess you're probably right. This causal attribution, right? We can be convinced of some pretty strange things. 72 million Americans voted to re-elect President Trump, as a case in point. In terms of the latter part of the question, continuing to plod along, well, you know, I'm really on board with William's perspective. I mean, the Anthropocene continues to accelerate, right? Do we have time to plod along in a business as usual mode? And my perspective is no, we don't. And so I've unfortunately forgotten the individual that made this phrase, but I think we're probably better off pressing for a new paradigm of how we're going to conduct rangeland stewardship.
Right. So I'm going to take the final 3 questions that have been posted, and then I'll end off just with the comments that were posted on Zander's question that he
Excellent.
had.
Excellent.
The next question is from Jim. Would you comment on the large increases in stocking rate claimed by Savory?
Well, as I pointed out initially, I think that was the really unique and attractive feature of his presentation when he came to the U.S. So we were very much about conservation and restoration already with our grazing systems, right? Well, he says, yeah, well, I can do that. I can prevent degradation. I can reverse desertification, and I can increase forage and animal production. Well, that got a lot of attention. And as we've seen with the ecological evidence in many farms that attempted to stock at higher rates, those have not proven to be viable. So I think that's one of these charismatic claims that were made, sort of like reducing atmospheric CO2 to pre-industrial levels that really detracts from the legitimacy that may exist with holistic management. And I think we need to look past those kinds of things.
Thank you for that. Then Mahmoud says, what is the difference between holistic systems and PRAGA, P-R-A-G-A?
I'm sorry, I'm unfamiliar with PRAGA systems.
I'm afraid I can't help there either. If you could please just post that question to us in writing and we'll get back to you. Then the last question now is an interesting one from Stephen Baker. And he says, thank you. What about the causal evidence obtained from rotational grazing in certain regards? Dr. Louis de Pisani seems to have had success with 8-camp systems. Gerard van Zyl, utilizing high-density grazing in the Free State, tripled their stocking rate. I would just like to know your thoughts on this. I agree with you concerning more arid environments. And to answer Heidi, Ridgedale Farm in Sweden, run by Richard Perkins, would be my best example of a highly successful holistic management and permaculture farm. He has a YouTube channel called Ridgedale Permaculture. So just some evidence.
That's a very, very relevant and important question. And I really should have probably addressed this in my presentation. But a few years ago, when I was involved with our U.S. Department of Agriculture evaluating some of the rangeland conservation strategies or practices, there was a pasture land group doing a similar thing for these mesic pastures that are dealing with introduced grasses in our southeast U.S. primarily. So they're several-fold more productive than our semi-arid rangeland systems. And in those particular cases, a lot of times monoculture or simple several species mixture of high productivity, rotational grazing systems do prove to be valuable there. So if the systems you're referencing are more mesic and of high productivity that is tenfold higher than semi-arid rangeland systems, which might be 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Then I certainly would understand that's the case. At the other extreme, in these arid systems, semi-arid systems, what I think still is an open question is if someone is managing very poorly with a continuous grazing system and paying relatively little attention to both land and animals. And they would go to a holistic management school, and then they would sort of shift their approach to management and become a much more attentive manager. I could envision, benefits being realized in that situation. Now, again, they're not ecological benefits from this rotational system, but it's just better management strategy. So there are just so many variables on how this can be interpreted that it really makes it difficult to come up with any definitive assessments.
Thank you for that. So that brings to a closure the questions. I'd like to just go back to Xander's question, which was if holistic management never existed, what hot topics or questions would the rangeland science community have tackled in its place? And we got four answers to that. Matthew Danquist says to burn or not to burn. That is the question. Yeah. Kevin Kirkman says a different spin on this question. Has rangeland science benefited from putting resources into chasing holistic management, or has it neglected other important aspects? Heidi Hawkins says rewilding to replace the livestock that has replaced wildlife. Perhaps we would have been addressing this sooner. And then Zander says rewilding and fire are great topics. And Kevin, I agree that your spin on the question is important to ask as well. And he also says, I think some of the missed opportunities include 1, exploring socio-ecological questions, 2, technology, e.g. virtual fencing, precision agriculture, remote sensing, and 3, elevating the role of rangelands in the global carbon cycle to that of tropical forests. So those were the audience responses to Xander's question.
Those were excellent, Xander. Excellent question. I might have, now that I've thought about it a little bit, I might have put in there a more full accounting of the diverse ecosystem services provided by global rangelands. I think we continue to overlook that, and I sort of think of it as rangelands sort of are operating under a marginalization paradigm, right? We simply focus on the limited and variable forage and livestock production that occurs, and at the same time we fail to understand the much more diverse and equally important ecosystem services that exist. So getting back to William's point, maybe we should be focusing more on this broad accounting of ecosystem services provided by global rangelands and not maybe de-emphasizing, but putting forage and livestock production in a more relevant context.
Great suggestions all around. So thank you, everybody. That was a really interesting webinar and great questions. Thank you for posting such difficult questions for David. And Kevin, I hand back to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Thanks for doing a great job with chairing it. And I'd like to just say a few words of thanks to a few people to end off. Firstly, thanks to the audience. You were a great audience, and there were some really interesting questions that have come out of this. And I hope that this has stimulated some debate that will go forward to our next conference as well. And it's a really interesting topic and something that we need to continue with. I'd like to just thank the people involved with organizing this, Franny, Debbie, and also Erica for all the background work in making this webinar happen. And then lastly, David, once again, a really big thanks to you. I think you've shown us what it is to really cut through everything and focus on the science. and bring science to the front of these debates and these issues that we are confronted with within our science and within our disciplines. So thank you very much for that. And once again, we're cognizant of the fact that it is Thanksgiving Day in the US. So thanks for giving up part of your Thanksgiving Day to address us.
Pleasure.
We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having more contact with you in future. And I'm quite sure that there might be some of the audience who will be emailing you with questions and comments later on.
I look forward to that.
I'm sure that will also stimulate some good debate going forward. But Thank you very much. Thanks to the audience. And then just in closing, I just want to say that the recordings of the previous webinars are available on the Grassland Society's YouTube site. And so you can watch the recordings of Sam Fuhlendorf's talk and Alan Knapp's talk on that site. We'll circulate the address for that site on social media. David, thanks a lot. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thanksgiving, and good night to the rest of the people in South Africa. Thanks.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.